They mocked America as soft. To them it was a nation of spoiled civilians and sugar-fed soldiers, a place where men drank coffee instead of enduring the taste of war. In the damp trenches and smoky barracks, laughter rolled through the ranks. They said the Americans would crumble the moment their chocolate ran out. They said comfort made a man weak, and in those words they found a way to ignore the hunger gnawing inside their own stomachs. It wasn't just talk, it was propaganda, carefully fed to them by the regime. In Hitler's Germany, even food was political. Scarcity was portrayed as sacrifice, and endurance was proof of superiority. The Ministry of Propaganda twisted every loaf of bread into a symbol of strength, every hunger pang into loyalty. To them, the soft life of the Americans was a warning, not a dream. Comfort was decadence, and decadence led to decay. German radios repeated the same stories until they became belief. America was lazy, overfed, addicted to pleasure and sugar. Its soldiers were said to survive on chocolate, canned fruit, and Coca-Cola. Goebbels' newspapers described them as industrial soldiers, built not from discipline but from indulgence. It made the men at the front feel righteous, even as they starved. If they were suffering, it must have meant they were stronger. That lie kept them standing. At night, around fires made from scrap wood, German soldiers told jokes about the Americans. They laughed at us. Troops needed steak to march and coffee to fight. They sneered at the photos of grinning GIs with cigarettes and candy, saying they were tourists, not warriors. The laughter filled the cold air, masking the fear that the Reich's victories were slowing. They could not admit that the soft enemy was still advancing, well-fed and relentless. Hunger became a kind of pride. The soldiers told themselves that deprivation forged discipline, that every missed meal hardened their resolve. Their black bread, cabbage soup and watery beer became symbols of endurance. They didn't know it was breaking them from the inside. The regime wanted their suffering. It made them easier to control. The lie was simple. To be hungry was to be pure. Behind the front lines, the propaganda machine continued its work. Posters showed rugged, thin soldiers smiling through hardship, proud of their sacrifice. German families saw these images and took comfort in their own hunger. Mothers told their children that while Americans wasted food, German boys fought with honor. It was a cruel illusion designed to keep them quiet while their cupboards emptied. No one was allowed to ask what all that suffering was for. In the offices of Berlin, Goebbels' ministry turned plenty into a sin. America's overflowing factories were recast as symbols of weakness. Their machines make men soft. One radio host declared, "Our struggle makes men strong." It was the kind of message people wanted to believe, especially when the bombs began to fall. It gave meaning to misery. It turned the pain of hunger into pride, and pride was easier to live on than the truth, but the cracks were starting to show. By 1943, soldiers wrote home complaining of thin rations and hollow stomachs. Their laughter about American comfort had begun to sound forced. When they captured Allied supplies, the mocking stopped. The tins of meat, the packets of coffee, the neat organization of it all. It didn't look like weakness. It looked like something terrifying. Capability. Behind every box of food was a system that never stopped moving. Some German officers quietly took note. America's abundance wasn't chaos. It was order disguised as plenty. The more they mocked it, the more it haunted them. How could a nation fight across oceans and still feed its soldiers like kings? The question lingered in the back of their minds as they chewed through their grey bread and boiled cabbage. It was a question they weren't supposed to ask. But doubt, once born, never dies easily. To the ordinary soldier, it was still easier to laugh. Easier to cling to pride than to face fear. Around the fires, they kept mocking the Americans, louder now, as if volume could make the lies true. They said comfort would rot the American soul, that victory would spoil them. But even as they joked, their eyes were sinking, their belts tightening. The Reich's strength was starving, and they didn't know it yet. By the final years of the war, the laughter had changed. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was quiet, brittle, uncertain. Reports from the front said that the soft Americans were unstoppable. Their tanks rolled on full stomachs. Their bombers flew without pause. German soldiers who once scoffed at American food now dreamed of it. The propaganda that once gave them pride had become a cruel echo. Hunger was no longer honor, it was defeat. Still, they clung to the illusion. To admit the truth would mean admitting everything had been a lie. So they mocked even harder. They said the Americans were spoiled, They said coffee was weakness, but somewhere inside they knew the truth. Comfort hadn't made the Americans weak. It had made them certain. The kind of certainty that only comes from knowing your nation can fight and still feed the world. When the surrender came, and the first groups of German prisoners were told they would be sent to America, the old jokes returned. "Let's see how the spoiled ones feed us," they said, pretending not to care. But the tone was different now. The laughter was strained, hiding something they didn't want to admit. For the first time, they were about to see if the myth they'd believed in could survive reality. As the ships crossed the Atlantic, they whispered among themselves. Some expected punishment, others feared starvation. All of them waited to see if the stories were true. They didn't know it yet, but the real shock would not come from cruelty. It would come from kindness. And when they finally sat down to eat, the laughter would end forever, because the first meal would tell them everything their propaganda never did. It would show them that America's strength wasn't in comfort, it was in confidence, the kind that could feed even its enemies without fear. And as they raised their first forkfuls of food in captivity, the truth would begin to unravel, bite by bite. They had crossed the ocean in silence, the hum of the ship's engines masking the weight in their chests. The prisoners stared out through the iron grates, seeing nothing but grey waves stretching endlessly in every direction. Somewhere beneath the surface, their pride sank with every mile. For months, they had clung to the idea that America was weak, that it was a hollow empire built on comfort. But as the coastline appeared in the distance, something inside them shifted. It wasn't fear of captivity anymore. It was curiosity, an uneasy curiosity about what awaited them on the other side. When the ships finally pulled into port, the German prisoners pressed against the rails. What they saw stunned them into silence. Towering cranes moved with mechanical precision, lifting containers as if the entire harbour were alive. Endless rows of trucks rumbled across wide, paved roads. Trains screeched, their cars stretching so far that their ends disappeared into the fog. The docks swarmed with workers, disciplined, focused, efficient. There was no chaos here, no sign of the softness they'd been told to expect. America was not starving, it was thriving, overflowing with power that seemed almost unnatural. As they were marched down the gangplanks, the prisoners could smell oil, steel, and bread all at once. The air itself carried industry. For many, it was their first look at the world beyond the Reich's reach. They tried to hide their astonishment, to keep their faces cold and defiant, but the scale of what they saw was impossible to ignore. Every machine, every whistle, every tower shouted a quiet truth. The enemy they had mocked had built something far greater than they had imagined. The laughter they once shared around campfires now felt childish, almost embarrassing. They boarded long trains guarded by American soldiers who spoke little and watched closely. The cars were cleaner than anything they had known in years. As the trains began to move, the prisoners leaned toward the barred windows. The countryside blurred past. Green fields, wide rivers, towns laid out in perfect order. Children played on front lawns. Women carried groceries home in paper bags, and everywhere they looked there was motion, abundance, and life. It was not the desperate, crumbling land their propaganda had promised. It was something frighteningly stable, frighteningly calm, a country that could wage a global war and still look untouched. One prisoner whispered, "This can't be real." Another muttered, "It's all for show." But no one truly believed that. The silence grew heavier with every passing mile. They watched farms stretch for miles, machines harvesting crops in perfect lines. They saw highways filled with cars, trucks carrying food and fuel to places they couldn't name. It was an organized rhythm of prosperity, a nation that moved like a single machine, fed not by desperation but by design. For men who had been told that luxury was weakness, the sight was disorienting. The world outside the wire of the Reich had been hidden from them, and now it stared them in the face. When the trains finally slowed, they found themselves at the gates of sprawling camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The sight of the fences brought a flicker of relief, something familiar at last. Captivity was supposed to look like this: cold, harsh, punishing. They were ready for it. They braced themselves for the hunger, the humiliation, the revenge they assumed would come. But as the gates opened, the air carried a smell none of them expected. It wasn't decay. It was food. Cooked food. The prisoners were led through rows of wooden barracks into a large mess hall. The sound of clattering dishes echoed from inside. Steam rose from the kitchens. The scent of roasted meat and baked bread drifted through the air. The men glanced at one another, uneasy. Some assumed it was a trick, a performance to make them lower their guard. They whispered that the Americans were fattening them up for labor, or worse. No one dared to speak above a whisper. Suspicion was easier than acceptance. Inside, the room was orderly. Long tables were arranged in perfect lines. The prisoners sat down under the watchful eyes of guards who didn't shout, didn't sneer, didn't strike. Then came the plates, real plates, not tin scraps, bread soft and fresh, meat warm and rich with flavor, vegetables, even potatoes with thick brown gravy. For a moment, no one moved. Forks hovered mid-air, eyes flicking from one face to another, waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. But none came. Only the quiet, steady rhythm of an American kitchen doing its work. The first bites were hesitant. The taste was unreal. Some prisoners froze, unable to swallow, as if guilt itself had lodged in their throats. Others devoured everything in silence, unable to stop. For years food had been rationed, stretched thin, flavored with substitutes and hunger. Now, in captivity, it was abundant, rich, and honest. They didn't know how to feel. It was nourishment wrapped in humiliation. To eat this well as prisoners felt like betrayal. Betrayal of the lies they had lived by. One man whispered, "We eat better as captives than our families do at home." The words hung in the air like smoke. Others refused to answer. A few looked down at their plates and muttered prayers they hadn't spoken since the war began. They had expected cruelty, starvation, and pain. But what they found was something worse, a generosity that stripped them of excuses. The propaganda had promised them moral superiority, but sitting there, with warm food in their mouths and guilt in their hearts, that illusion began to rot. When the meal ended, no one spoke. The guards collected the plates, and the prisoners were led out again. In the barracks that night, they lay awake, staring at the wooden ceilings. The smell of food still lingered on their hands. Some laughed bitterly, calling it manipulation, a psychological trick to make them obedient. Others stayed silent, because deep down they knew it wasn't. The Americans didn't feed them to win their loyalty. They fed them because they could, and that, more than any weapon, made them dangerous. Days passed, and the same meals kept coming. The prisoners stopped flinching when the guards handed them trays. They stopped expecting cruelty. Each morning, the smell of coffee filled the camp, rich and dark. For many, it was the first real coffee they had tasted in years. That smell alone shattered something inside them. It was impossible to reconcile with the image they had built of America. The soft nation that was supposed to fall apart had built a system so strong it could feed its enemies without hesitation. With every meal, the disbelief deepened. The propaganda that once defined their world began to unravel piece by piece. They started to see the truth, not in speeches or symbols, but in the quiet efficiency of kitchens, the calm discipline of the guards, the order that never faltered. This wasn't a nation of indulgence, it was a nation of confidence, a power that didn't need to prove itself through cruelty, a civilization so secure in its strength that even mercy had become a weapon. And as the nights grew longer, some of the men began to wonder what would happen if their families could see this place, these clean halls, these full plates, this impossible contradiction of war and kindness. Would they believe it? Or would they cling to the lie as they once did? The laughter that had carried them across the Atlantic was gone. What replaced it was a quiet respect, mixed with something harder to admit, admiration. Their first days in America had begun as punishment. But as the days turned to weeks, something in them began to change. The jokes died, the arrogance faded, and in its place grew a strange, reluctant truth. They had been wrong. America was not soft. Its abundance was not weakness. It was strength, an effortless, terrifying strength that needed no cruelty to command respect. And that realization, more than defeat itself, was what broke them. The moment they stepped into the mess hall, the air itself felt unreal. The scent of warm bread, roasted meat, and coffee drifted across the room like something forbidden. For men who had spent years chewing on dry rations and bitter pride, it was overwhelming. Some stood frozen, afraid to move. Others stared at the tables lined with trays, utensils, and steaming plates. It didn't look like a prison. It looked like a feast, and that alone broke something inside them. The guards didn't bark orders. They didn't shove. They simply gestured for the prisoners to take their seats. The Germans hesitated, expecting the cruelty they had been trained to expect from soft enemies. But it didn't come. Instead, they were served by American cooks, smiling faintly, as if feeding former enemies was just another day's work. The prisoners' hands shook as they lifted their forks. Some wept silently before they even took a bite. For years they had believed that comfort made men weak. Yet here they were, defeated, sitting before men who were both comfortable and strong. Every bite of food was a contradiction. The bread was soft, the coffee rich, the portions generous. It was a meal that said, "This is what power really looks like. It doesn't need to humiliate. It doesn't need to starve. It conquers by abundance." And in that moment, the laughter they once used to mock America turned into silence. Letters home told the story differently, but between the lines, shame lingered. "We eat well here," some prisoners wrote, "better than we did in the army." But what they didn't write was how it made them feel. Each meal reminded them that they had fought for an illusion, a nation that glorified hunger while hiding its own decay. The Reich had told them that sacrifice was honor, that suffering was purity. But now, fed by their enemies, that entire foundation began to crumble. The POW camps in America were nothing like the dark cages they had imagined. Barbed wire, yes, but inside there were clean beds, showers, libraries, even football fields. Some were given jobs, paid small wages, and allowed to send money home. The structure was strict but fair. It was in many ways more humane than what they had known from their own command. The realization was unbearable. If this was the enemy, then what had their leaders turned them into? At night, when the lights dimmed and the camp quieted, conversations grew heavy. Men who once parroted Nazi slogans now spoke in whispers about the absurdity of it all. "They treat us better than our own officers did," one would say. Another would reply, "Maybe they're trying to make us soft." The words always carried a defensive edge, as if admitting admiration was treason. But deep down, admiration was already taking root. Over time, curiosity replaced fear. They began to observe their captors, the way American soldiers joked freely with each other, the way rank seemed to weigh less, the way they carried confidence without arrogance. It was a different kind of strength, not born from obedience but from trust, from the idea that comfort and kindness were not weaknesses, but extensions of stability. It was the opposite of everything the Nazi machine had drilled into them. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg, began keeping notes in secret. He wrote that the American system feeds the man so that he may think, not so that he may serve. His words spread quietly through the camp, and soon discussions about democracy and freedom began to ripple among men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler. Some tore up the swastika patches from their old uniforms and burned them in secret. It was symbolic, but it felt like breathing after years underwater. The guards noticed the change too. There were fewer fights, less tension. Some even began exchanging small conversations through the fence, questions about baseball, jazz, or home. To the Americans, these men were no longer monsters, just young soldiers who had believed the wrong things. And to the Germans, that was the most disarming truth of all. They were being forgiven for sins they hadn't even confessed yet. For the first time in years, they saw the power of choice. In the Reich, choice was dangerous. Here, it was ordinary. The prisoners learned English, read American newspapers, watched as their captors discussed politics openly, something unthinkable back home. They saw black soldiers in uniform, women working in the kitchens, immigrants serving as guards. The world inside that camp was not the one they had been told existed. The world they fought against didn't seem weak, it seemed alive. But acceptance came slowly, shadowed by guilt. Some men refused to eat, unable to stomach the kindness. They said the food tasted like defeat. Others overate, as if trying to fill the emptiness of everything they had lost. A few still clung to their old pride, insisting it was all a trick, propaganda meant to break their spirit. Yet day after day the meals kept coming. Unconditional, steady, undeniable. The lie they once lived by began to dissolve, quietly but completely. Months passed, and the rhythm of captivity became routine. The prisoners began to feel something they hadn't felt in years: safety. It wasn't freedom, but it was a kind of peace. Some started to laugh again, but this time the laughter was real, not defensive. They laughed at their own old jokes about Americans, realizing now how absurd they were. The soft nation they mocked had built a machine so efficient that even its prisons were humane. That was not softness. It was mastery. As they adjusted, the prisoners began writing essays and reflections for camp newsletters. Many wrote about the mystery of American strength. They described it not as physical power, but as a moral one, the ability to remain human even in victory. The concept was intoxicating. It made them question everything. If their enemies could show mercy, then what had they been fighting for? What was all that sacrifice, all that hunger, all that cruelty for? When Red Cross officials came to inspect the camps, they were astonished by the discipline and civility of the prisoners. One report noted, "They behave as if they wish to earn their place in this world again." And perhaps that was true. For many of them, these camps became not just places of captivity, but of awakening. They entered as soldiers of a broken empire, and in small ways began to emerge as men again. But even as their minds opened, a quiet dread remained, because they knew that one day they would have to go home, to a Germany that had collapsed under its own lies. The kindness they found here would become a burden there. They feared the hunger waiting for them, the ruins, the reckoning. Yet something inside them had changed forever. The mockery that once fueled them had turned into a lesson, a painful one but necessary. And in the final months of the war, when the news of Hitler's death reached them, the camps fell silent. There were no cheers, no tears, just an understanding that the world they knew was gone. The soft Americans had outlasted the empire of steel. The irony was complete. Strength had not come from hunger, cruelty, or hate. It had come from something far more dangerous to tyranny: compassion. As the prisoners looked across the fences at their captors, they realized that they had witnessed something the world rarely sees in war: victory without vengeance. And that realization would haunt them long after the gates opened again. Because once a man has tasted kindness in the place he expected punishment, he can never see strength the same way again. When the war finally ended, the camps began to empty. One by one, the German prisoners packed what little they had: letters, worn clothes, and the weight of lessons they never expected to learn. The trucks that came to take them away didn't carry the sound of chains, only the silence of men unsure of what waited beyond the wire. For years that fence had been their world. Now freedom felt like exile. They were being sent back to a country they no longer recognized, a home that no longer existed. The ships that carried them across the Atlantic were quiet places. Some men stood on the deck and stared at the horizon, watching America fade into a thin grey line behind them. For many, it wasn't the departure from captivity that hurt. It was leaving the strange dignity they had found there. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were prisoners of memory. Every warm meal, every act of kindness, every glimpse of how their enemies lived, it haunted them. When they arrived in Germany, the shock was brutal. Cities lay in ruins, streets were silent, and hunger filled the air like smoke. The once proud Reich was now a graveyard of broken ideologies. Families rummaged through rubble for scraps of food, and children played in bombed-out buildings with nothing but sticks and imagination. Compared to the order and abundance of the camps, this was a descent back into chaos. For many returning soldiers, the idea of home had lost all meaning. The first days were filled with disbelief. They had been told the Americans would destroy everything, that occupation meant humiliation. But what they saw was something else: reconstruction, discipline, and structure. American soldiers distributed food to civilians, helped rebuild roads, even handed out chocolate to children. The same kindness that had stunned them in captivity was now reshaping their homeland. It was mercy on a scale they had never imagined, and for some, it was unbearable. The older officers tried to resist the change. They called it manipulation, psychological warfare dressed as generosity. They want to make us forget who we are. One captain spat as he watched American trucks deliver flour to starving Germans. But the younger men stayed quiet. They had already seen what strength looked like, and it didn't come from cruelty. The truth was spreading quietly like an infection of humility, and once it started, no ideology could stop it. For years they had been told that mercy was weakness, but now mercy was everywhere, on the faces of enemy soldiers, in the food lines, in the quiet moments of rebuilding. It was a weapon stronger than fear. In post-war Germany, it was the Americans, not the Nazis, who controlled the narrative. They didn't do it through propaganda this time. They did it through action, through the simple, disarming power of feeding the hungry. Some former POWs began to volunteer with the reconstruction efforts. They worked under American supervision, repairing railways, clearing rubble, helping distribute aid. For them, it was more than work. It was penance. They had come to understand something their leaders never could, that dominance built on hate collapses, but dominance built on humanity endures. It was a bitter truth, but one that slowly began to heal the rot inside them. Letters between former prisoners reveal the inner conflict of that time. They treat us like people, one man wrote, and that is the hardest part to accept. Another wrote, I cannot stop thinking of the camp food, not because it was good, but because it was given. To them, those meals had become symbols, reminders of a moral balance that Germany had lost. It was not the food itself that broke them. It was the realization that their enemies had won not just the war, but the moral argument. In the months that followed, the American occupation became both a mirror and a teacher. The Marshall Plan began to flow, factories reopened, and the German people began to rebuild under the very system they had been taught to despise. Democracy, once mocked as weakness, became the blueprint for survival. And in countless small towns, returning POWs became quiet advocates for the new way of life. They didn't speak of ideology anymore. They spoke of decency, of structure, of feeding, not starving. But not everyone accepted it. Some still clung to the old lies, whispering that the Americans were trying to erase Germany's soul. They called those who adapted traitors of the fatherland. Yet even those voices were fading. Hunger silences pride, and mercy rewrites memory. Over time, the new Germany began to take shape, not through conquest or obedience, but through gratitude. And at the center of that transformation were the men who had once mocked the very nation that now rebuilt theirs. For many, the hardest part was facing their families. They had left home as warriors and returned as witnesses, carrying stories that defied everything their people had believed. Mothers and wives asked about captivity, expecting tales of cruelty and suffering. Instead, they heard of food, fairness, and decency. Some didn't believe it. Others wept, because deep down they understood what it meant. Everything they had sacrificed had been for a lie. As the years passed, silence became their only refuge. Most never spoke publicly about what they had seen, to admit that their enemies had treated them better than their own nation had treated its heroes. It was unthinkable. Yet in their actions, the truth endured. They taught their children compassion. They rejected fanaticism. And when new political movements rose whispering, promises of purity and strength, they turned away. The war had ended, but its quiet aftermath reshaped generations. Historians later found records of POWs who wrote essays in the late 1940s, reflecting on their captivity in America. One wrote, "They defeated us without hatred. That is why we will never defeat them." Another confessed, "It was not their weapons that conquered us. It was their confidence." These writings were small, almost forgotten, but they carried a kind of wisdom that Germany would build its future upon. Because in their humiliation, they had glimpsed the real power of a moral nation. Some former prisoners even returned to America years later, as civilians working in trade or industry. They spoke fluent English, carried American habits, and described their time in the camps not as imprisonment, but as transformation. Many said it was there, behind barbed wire, that they learned what it truly meant to be free. It was a bitter irony. Freedom discovered in captivity, kindness received from an enemy. But for them, it was the only truth that mattered. By the 1950s, the scars of war had begun to fade, but the memory of those meals, those first warm plates in American hands, remained etched in the minds of those who lived it. They had entered the camps, mocking the softness of their captors. They left believing that compassion was the highest form of strength. The laughter that once filled their barracks had been replaced by a silence heavy with understanding. It was not defeat that broke them. It was dignity, and somewhere deep in that silence, a new kind of German identity began to take shape, not built on pride or conquest, but on reflection, on the memory of kindness where hatred was expected, on the realization that power does not come from fear, it comes from self-control. The very thing they had once mocked in their enemy had become their salvation. The lie had died, and from its ashes, something human began to grow again. Years later, when the smoke of war had long cleared and the world began to rebuild, the memory of those American prison camps lingered like a strange dream. For the men who had lived through it, it wasn't just a chapter of survival, it was the moment their understanding of power changed forever. They had been soldiers of a broken ideology, fed on hatred, told that mercy was weakness and indulgence a sin, yet the world they found behind enemy lines defied everything they had been trained to believe. It was not cruelty that conquered them, it was generosity. Some of them tried to forget, they buried their memories, beneath years of labor and silence, working in bombed-out factories or on reconstructed rail lines, pretending that the war had never touched them so deeply. But in quiet moments, over morning coffee, in the smell of fresh bread, or the sound of a train whistle, they remembered the taste of real coffee after years of bitter substitutes, the warmth of soup served without malice, the way an American guard would nod in silence instead of sneer. It wasn't the food that had broken them, it was the decency behind it. For those who could never quite let go, that decency became a mirror. They compared it to what they had once called loyalty, to the brutal efficiency of the Reich that demanded everything but gave nothing in return. The contrast was unbearable. The America they had mocked as decadent had turned out to be something far more dangerous to tyranny. It was functional, confident, and quietly moral. It didn't need to scream its superiority. It simply lived it, one plate, one act of fairness at a time. And that quiet strength was what stayed with them. In post-war Germany, those memories became seeds. Men who had once laughed at American weakness began teaching their children about a different kind of courage. Some became teachers, some engineers, some farmers, but all carried the same hidden lesson, that strength without empathy leads only to ruin. The fathers who had fought for Hitler now taught their sons not to follow any man who promised greatness through hate. It was a generational shift born not from speeches or politics, but from the shock of kindness in captivity. Decades later, when historians interviewed former prisoners, they often spoke with hesitation, as if afraid to admit what they truly felt. One said, "I learned more about humanity in an American camp than in 10 years under the Reich." Another confessed, "They fed us when we would not have fed them." I have thought about that every day since. These weren't words of guilt, they were words of revelation. To men raised in a world that equated mercy with weakness, that single act of being fed by an enemy rewired something fundamental inside them. Even those who never spoke of it carried it quietly. Their letters, their behavior, their choices after the war, all showed traces of that awakening. When the next generation grew up asking, "How did it happen? How did we become what we were?" These men gave simple answers. They didn't speak of ideology, they spoke of coffee, of bread, of how their enemies had fed them without hatred. It was the smallest details that told the biggest truths. And in those truths, Germany found a path toward redemption. But the transformation wasn't only theirs. The Americans, too, had learned something through that act. Feeding their enemies wasn't just policy, it became a test of national character. It proved to themselves and the world that their strength came not from revenge, but from control. They could destroy when needed, yet they chose to build. They could humiliate, yet they chose restraint. In that balance of power and mercy, America shaped not only its victory, but its moral legacy. For the prisoners, it was impossible to separate that legacy from memory. They had seen America's strength up close, not just its machines or its armies, but the invisible discipline that allowed it to fight a world war and still show compassion. Every warm meal was a lesson in stability. Every clean camp was a reminder that order didn't need cruelty to exist. The same men who had mocked softness came to understand that real strength isn't loud. It's quiet. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply endures. Years later, when these men grew old, they told their grandchildren stories that began not with battles, but with meals. They spoke of disbelief, of how they had expected starvation and instead found structure and warmth. Some wept as they spoke, others smiled faintly, unsure how to explain what it had meant. But all of them carried the same conclusion, that America had defeated them twice, once with weapons and once with decency. The first victory had ended the war. The second had changed them forever. For some, that change turned into gratitude so deep they could never leave it behind. A few returned to America not as prisoners, but as immigrants. They built homes, raised families, and worked in the same industries that had once fueled the Allied war effort. They didn't talk about the past much, but when they did, they spoke with quiet reverence. They had seen the real power of a nation not in its threats, but in its confidence to treat even enemies with humanity. To them, that was America's secret weapon, the ability to win without hatred. In those years, as the world divided once again between East and West, the memory of that mercy became something larger than a personal story. It became a contrast between two systems, the fear-driven rigidity of totalitarianism and the steady, unshaken belief of democracy. The men who had once sneered at freedom now understood it in its purest form. Not as slogans, but as behavior. It was freedom that allowed the Americans to feed their captives without fear of losing control. Freedom that gave them the confidence to act human, even in war. And so the story of those meals became something like a legend, rarely told but always remembered. Historians would later call it one of the quietest moral victories of the war. It was proof that compassion could undermine propaganda more effectively than bullets, that no speech, no leaflet, no broadcast could have shattered Nazi myths more completely than a single cup of coffee served without hate. In that small gesture, America had rewritten what victory could look like. For the men who lived it, that lesson never faded. When they spoke of war, they didn't glorify it. They spoke of contrasts between destruction and discipline, cruelty and calm, pride and humility. They had seen the worst of humanity, and then, unexpectedly, one of its best faces. To them, the camps were not just prisons, they were revelations. They were the places where they realized that a nation's true power is measured not by how much fear it can inspire, but by how much good it can afford to give. And as time moved forward, that quiet truth rippled outward, shaping not just lives, but legacies. The laughter that had once mocked the Americans' supposed softness had long since turned to respect. The same soldiers who once swore they would never bow to their enemies now told their children about a strength that didn't need cruelty to command loyalty. What they had once seen as weakness, they now saw as civilization itself. In the end, for thousands of German soldiers, the war's final lesson didn't come on the battlefield or in surrender. It came at a table, in the clatter of cutlery, in the smell of bread, in the taste of coffee freely given. They had expected vengeance. What they found instead was something infinitely stronger, the power to forgive without forgetting, to feed without fear. And that, more than any weapon or victory parade, was the true face of America, the quiet power that wins not through domination, but through dignity.